Thank you for joining the Nonprofit Learning Lab's free online webinar. You are currently participating in Embracing Strategic Planning as a Community Engagement Tool. Questions are encouraged throughout the webinar, and you may type them into the question box as they arise, which is likely on the right-hand side of your screen. Your presenter today is Sarah Keister Armstrong. Sarah Keister Armstrong is the Principal Consultant of Sarah Keister Armstrong & Associates, LLC. Sarah has provided evaluation, strategic planning, and grant writing consulting services to public and nonprofit organizations since 2013. She brings experience in statistical analysis and using quantitative and qualitative measures to evaluate public policies and programs. Her expertise helps organizations effectively collect and analyze meaningful data, determine the implications of data on organizations' planning goals, and communicate the nexus of data, planning, and action. I will now hand it over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, and hi everyone. I'm thrilled to be presenting on this topic today, so let's dive right in. This presentation will focus on the intersection of strategic planning and community engagement, how to leverage the natural overlap between the two to strengthen our capacity to plan for our organization's futures. It's a topic I'm really passionate about. Effective community engagement that includes both mutual respect and transparency gives nonprofit organizations like yours this opportunity to imagine what is really possible. Beyond what you're talking about in your board meetings, beyond your staff meetings, it expands your circles to give you this freedom to think about what your organization can be doing. This presentation is intended to connect the dots between community engagement and strategic planning and discuss how you can use strategic planning processes as an opportunity to enhance your community engagement work. Some of you may be preparing to embark on a new strategic planning project soon. Some of you, may have never participated in one before, or, I think we've seen a lot the past 18 months. Maybe some of you have pumped the brakes in the middle of a planning process earlier this year. It's my hope that by the end of the session, you'll be better prepared to identify stakeholders to include in your next strategic planning process, even if that process is a couple of years down the road. You'll have some actionable tips to use when you are ready to seek input from those within your organization and those in the broader community that your organization serves. And you'll be equipped and hopefully excited to pull together all this information into a plan that moves your organization forward. When we embark on a strategic planning process, what we're really doing is looking to do a few things to identify our strengths, figure out, what is pulling our organization in a particular direction and why, and then what our organization's role is within that direction. Strategic planning is all about prioritizing your work. Now, sometimes getting others on board with strategic planning is in itself a struggle. Community engagement has this friendly and excited ring to it. And compared to strategic planning, it's just no secret that strategic planning can be time consuming. It can be seen as a challenge, cumbersome, or nebulous, but I don't believe it has to be that way. When you capitalize on your new strategic planning process and incorporate meaningful community engagement into the process, you can create this energy that is enthusiastic for your organization's future, for any new projects or new ideas that you want to pursue, and often a very positive element for staff, perhaps the elimination of things that just aren't working that well. Engagement with the community is a two-way interaction with the organization and the community that it serves, and it's strengthened naturally by going to the community, whether that is the public or organizations that you serve, whatever your community looks like, hearing their needs and then taking that information back and allowing it to inform the programs and services offered from your organization. Quite frankly, effective community engagement will bring more ideas to your table. It will make your strategic plan more likely to be successful because it will reflect the values of multiple audiences connected to your organization rather than only those at the top level. I'm sure many of you have participated in a planning process in the past that was so insular or uninspiring that the resulting plan was just kind of thrown on a shelf and never seen again. And we really want to avoid that going forward. By inviting your stakeholders and different audiences to contribute to your planning efforts in this way, you're not only welcoming a participatory process, which has value itself, but you're also giving an opportunity to, as an organization, be held accountable for actually making progress on the goals that you set. So it's no secret that in the nonprofit world, we're all coming from different places in quote unquote normal times. But now we've seen this full spectrum of effects of the COVID-19 crisis on nonprofit organizations, from those as severe as requiring organizations to close their doors to outcomes that are as positive as seeing an explosion in giving. Depending on the nature of your work, your industry, your geographic location, the needs of your community, different organizations have had vastly different experiences. And I want to point this out because there just isn't a template to follow to come out of this. We need to question, where do we go from here? What does this particular crisis mean for our organization, regardless of what is happening across the industry? And this is when you should be turning to your community, those within your inner circles, but just as importantly, those out of them. And I want to have you answer this quick poll question. I'd love to hear from you as we jump into talking about some ways of engaging our community in planning. Which of the following has your organization historically been the least likely to seek feedback from? We have a few options listed on your screen: staff, individual donors, and that can include your major donors, the individuals or families or other constituencies that you serve, funding organizations, which can include those like corporate sponsors or grant funders, and partner organizations, groups that support your work in other ways. As the poll is going on, I wanted to take a quick few seconds to express that in my work, I conduct a lot of individual interviews and listening sessions with these type of stakeholder groups. And especially in the past year, I've heard from people in each of these groups who have expressed to me how grateful they were for the opportunity to share feedback, and that no one had actually ever asked them questions related to the organization's future before. So it's interesting to me as an external evaluator that they would be so forthcoming in their appreciation of being included in a listening session or in an interview. These are often community leaders or staff members who are just not included in high-level management discussions, who are really thrilled to give honest feedback. So it just kind of shows, as an example of the past year, what a great opportunity using community engagement in a strategic planning process can be. Okay, so we seem pretty across the board here. It looks like funding organizations is among the least likely that you're to seek feedback from, and interestingly, the individuals or families that you serve. So thank you for completing that. We'll try to touch on each of these categories throughout the presentation. So again, community engagement is this idea of going out to the community with ideas and offerings, activating your community through those means, and then ideally taking in feedback from that opportunity. Listening is by far the most essential skill of both strategic planning and community engagement. It's the soft skill that really, if you are an effective listener, will serve you well in both of these types of work. It's not about the opinions of the loudest voices or the people who use your organization the most or the people who have lived in your community the longest. Effective listening is really meaning that people will know that the comments and concerns and aspirations that they provide to you are heard and valued, regardless of who they are and the influence they may or may not have. So who exactly should we be listening to? We break down 4 different categories of stakeholder groups for you to consider, and I recognize that all of your organizations that you're representing are structured in a different way and your audiences may not be identical. So with that in mind, think about this first one, who your organization serves. Maybe it's under-resourced families. Maybe it's pet parents looking to adopt a new furry friend. Maybe it's professionals who belong to an association. Those people would all fall under this category of those you serve, and you absolutely want to get their input to find out not only what their needs are and how your organization can best meet them, but where they see their futures going and how your organization can play a role in that. Increasingly, we're also seeing from funding organizations this desire to have input from those your organization is serving to really increase the participation and collaboration between all these stakeholder groups. So the benefit of getting input from those you serve is really multiplied as we move forward. Next, we have this group of those who support your organization. This would be your donors, your grantors, other funders. You know, find out what moves your individual donors to support you. What types of impact would they want to invest in the future? This could be something that you're doing throughout your development program. You know, maybe you're finding out why donors give and that kind of thing, but we can expand on that and ask, you know, where do they see your organization going and what role do they want to play in that future? Next, those who lead decision making. This will be your board, your staff leadership, and any advisory council you may have. I encourage you to give these individuals a chance to actually provide input on an individual basis before coming together as a group later in the strategic planning project. Often these people, your board members, your staff leadership, those are the people who are going to be finalizing your strategic plan. But the actual planning process itself will go more smoothly if people like your board members can give their individual opinions and perspectives at the beginning of the process and provide context before coming together as a group after you've done all the rest of your community engagement work. Often the conversation of providing input about an organization's strengths or weaknesses is much different than at the end of the project coming together and actually setting goals. So I think it's important to offer some distinction there. Last, those who implement, your staff, your volunteers. It's not only crucial to get buy-in from the people who will actually be implementing your strategic plan, but the people who implement the work are the heart and soul of your organization. They know the ins and outs of your programs, of your services, what you're offering in a way that is more intimate than anyone else. So it's really essential that you listen to these voices and not just those at the highest levels of management. Often, you know, we see frontline staff have really great ideas and they're often not given the opportunity to express those. So it's a great, if you can manage it, it's a great opportunity to allow your staff to participate in this part of a strategic planning process. So what does this actually look like? What tools do we have in our belts? Community engagement and strategic planning will look differently depending on your community and the capacity of your organization at any given point in time. There are a lot of tools that we can consider to connect with the different audiences that we identified on the previous slide, and each of these tools has its own advantages and disadvantages, many that are unique to the pandemic we currently find ourselves in. So our first one is surveys. We're all familiar with surveys. An important thing with these, we can definitely reach a large number of people pretty easily, especially if it's something that is, you know, based online. If we have the email infrastructure to get something out quickly, it's easy to get those back. An important thing with surveys, and this may seem obvious, but it's easy to overlook, is that you have to make your survey accessible. You have to make it as easy as possible for people to receive, to fill it out, to return it. We all know in today's world that people are really, really busy, and increasingly if things aren't delivered directly to them in a way that they see their input will have value, they're not going to see it, and they're definitely not going to respond to it. So if you do plan to do a survey and you want responses, you really cannot be passive about this. It just requires a little bit of thinking and some strategy to figure out, what's the best way to get a survey out to the audience that we'd like to target? Is a survey the best option? Do we have a way of reaching a large group of people? Next, focus groups or listening sessions are a great way of convening a group of community members, leaders of partner organizations, donors, some of these groups that we've talked about a little bit earlier. Focus groups or listening sessions can provide really meaningful feedback when they're facilitated by an external party, and when the purpose of the conversation is clear and communicated ahead of time. So I've seen a lot of organizations conduct focus groups on their own, and that's completely understandable given budgetary constraints, but a third-party facilitator will kind of eliminate some of that bias. It's, hard to complain about an organization when a paid staff member is conducting the focus group. So if you're really interested in unbiased, honest feedback, having someone just run that conversation for you can produce some really meaningful feedback. And then last, community conversations have been increasingly utilized by public serving organizations. Public libraries have really played a huge role in advancing these kind of community conversations. They informally gather and discuss community members' aspirations for their communities. So it goes beyond your organization and is kind of looking at, what challenges do they anticipate being confronted with in the future? It takes a little bit of a more holistic view of community engagement, but then gives you as an organization an opportunity to find out kind of where you fit into those gaps. In a perfect world, you could include a few of these different community engagement tools during your strategic planning process to triangulate your feedback and make sure that you're hearing from a cross-section of voices and not just, your very loyal base. It's often particularly valuable to hold community conversations or focus groups or listening sessions following a survey, after a survey, because those kinds of live discussions can provide a rich opportunity to really engage in a topic or follow up on something from the survey findings that might have been surprising to you or that might warrant some in-depth conversation that, a survey question might not necessarily allow for. That being said, we need to always be aware during any kind of community engagement work, and definitely throughout a strategic planning process, that we're not just hearing the same voices over and over and over again. Reaching voices that are not traditionally heard, this act of going out to the community to ensure that, you're not just meeting the needs of those who are already engaged with your organization or those who are already supporting your organization. It's not community engagement to simply provide services to people who are already using those services, right? It's a good thing to do. You shouldn't stop doing that. But if you want to move forward as an organization, build this culture of inclusivity, identifying the needs of the entire community or audience that you're striving to serve is really important. And to do that, you need to go outside of your inner circle, outside of your existing base of those you serve, and engage those you aren't hearing from on a regular basis. That being said, we also know that the nonprofit workforce is usually not representative of the communities that nonprofit organizations are serving. So at this time when we're increasingly committed as an industry to helping to dismantle some of these policies and structures that contribute to, systemic problems like systemic racism, inequity, 87% of executive directors of nonprofit organizations are white. So we need to constantly confront biases that negatively influence these foundational values of equity, and recognizing if your organization is not representative of the community that you're serving, that is a limitation that we need to confront. Community engagement and strategic planning, of course, need to be part of that conversation. So planning in a silo or with our blinders on to things that we, aren't experienced with or things that we aren't aware of, it eliminates this opportunity to hear from people with different lived experiences than us or than our staff. It enforces all of these problematic consequences that are listed here of not engaging with a representative cross-section of our communities. Our perspectives are limited. We will have unchecked assumptions, and we'll hear what we want to hear or what we're expecting to hear in the form of a biased feedback loop. And escaping this is challenging work, and it can be uncomfortable, but recognizing who's not at the table and who needs to be at the table will help address a lot of these things. So if you've ever been involved in community engagement work or a strategic planning process that did not result in the level of community participation you were hoping for, let's take a minute and think about why. Was the purpose of the project clearly communicated? Not everyone knows what a strategic plan is, for an example. It can be kind of a corporate term. Did people in this process know and understand why the organization was asking for their input? Did they feel like it was relevant to them? We are all confronted with requests to fill out surveys all the time, on our receipts at the grocery store, after a doctor's appointment, when we get our car fixed, after calling customer service at a cable company. So if you think about what inspires you personally to answer those calls for input, it's really only the opportunities when you feel that your voice will actually be heard and will actually make an impact on a decision, right? So along those lines, carefully consider any barriers to participation among the audiences that you would like to engage in your strategic planning project. If you want to hold in-person sessions, like for community conversations or focus groups, are children permitted to attend? Is childcare a barrier for single parents or others in the audience that you're trying to reach? Are community engagement opportunities made available to those without transportation, those who speak a language other than English, or those who feel uncomfortable participating for whatever reason? And we're seeing a lot of that right now, with some people returning to in-person activity and some not. So really, we need to think about these fundamental qualities that are needed for our communities to fully engage with our organizations in a meaningful way. And those boil down to three things: trust, integrity, and having a common future. People essentially want to know that you will believe what they say, that you will consider their input, and that you'll act in their best interest to advance your organization that is shared among others. COVID-19, it's easy to fall into a trap these days because every person, every family has been impacted by the pandemic, almost always in some kind of negative way. And that is definitely going to funnel through to how we approach community engagement and different components of strategic planning. In this way, when we think as individuals, when we as individuals are facing a challenge, it becomes quite easy to generalize our particular challenge as being the same struggles that others are facing. So if you, like me, have had children doing remote learning, it's easy to fall into this trap of thinking that this is the reality of many other people, when in reality, everyone is facing the pandemic in a different way, and we all have different challenges based on our own individual circumstances. So while it's likely that all of these different audiences that are connected to your organization have been impacted by COVID, it's really not clear how or the severity of what that impact is. The pandemic has essentially revealed to us how even different segments of a community that appears to be the same, how the values and backgrounds of different parts of a community that aren't necessarily that visible under normal circumstances can strongly affect how they perceive what your organization is doing. So for some of the audiences that you want to reach during a strategic planning process, it just might not be the right time for robust community engagement. For others, it may be exactly and fervently the right time to broaden your outreach strategy. This is a time where it's important to recognize that you know your communities best. And if there is a risk of overburdening various audiences with requests for input, especially this year, maybe even going into the fall and winter, depending on what our lives look like, depending on the challenges some of these audiences are facing, it may not be the most convenient time for them to participate, and it may not be the time that will produce the most meaningful or actionable steps for your organization. So engaging your community at a time and in a way that excludes those who can't participate right now, it could easily lead to this fallacy of believing that you're meeting the needs of the entire community, when in reality, we might be turning away from the needs of another segment of the community just based on what is happening right now in terms of our current events and in terms of our public health. I wanted to provide an example of this. So for example, planning in a bubble is when organizations make decisions based on the knowledge they already have and without consideration of those outside its boardroom. It's why it irks us when we see local school boards making decisions in a way that makes it seem like the loudest 25 parents are representing the entire community. It feels like the rest of the community is just not being engaged. It feels less important. And it ultimately makes them feel alienated, not just from the decision-making process, but from the organization itself. And that's something we want to avoid in a strategic planning project. You know, it's easy to hear the voices that are the loudest, especially when they're our own voices, and it takes a conscious effort to dive deeper and find out what the temperature really is. So having a better understanding of your community before and during a situation like this is going to help you temper some of these non-representative inputs and guide decision-making that takes into account a greater share of your community. And by building in the input of all these audiences that we've talked about, those you serve, those who make decisions, those who implement, and those who support you, you'll have a more well-rounded view of what your organization needs to do going forward. So you've done your survey, you've had some listening sessions, great. Pandemic aside, during a strategic planning process in which you receive a lot of this input from a lot of different audiences outside of your immediate circle, you will inevitably receive some ideas or very passionate suggestions that will just not be feasible or even possible to come to fruition. And that's okay. The important part of community engagement during strategic planning, this listening part that we talked about earlier, it means that you will simply fully consider the input that you receive, but not that you are required to act on every idea you hear. I find that when we get to this point, you know, you've collected all this data and you've had all this input, I find that the best way to sort through the feedback received through a process like this is to have it all in the same place. So convene a group. Maybe it's staff members with a couple board members and a couple volunteers and a community leader. Review the data that you've received from a survey or focus groups and actually talk about what it means. You know, look beyond the numbers and into the responses provided through any kind of open-ended comments and note what the trends are. Together, consider the notes from your community conversations or your focus groups. Most importantly, what are the major trends? You know, where did some of those conversations tend to steer? What are the collective aspirations of your community? And what were commonly referenced challenges or worries? That's a key place that your organization can play a role. At the same time, as a group, and I think we all have experiences we can point to here, listen to the topics that you as a planning group are fixated on and the topics that you are avoiding. Sometimes these conversations moving from community engagement to action are uncomfortable. They may involve making decisions about how to allocate resources in a way that is not going to be unanimous. So use your community engagement work to challenge some of these internal assumptions about how you think the organization should move forward and make sure that you're being responsive to some of the ideas that you received. I generally advise nonprofit organizations to have this initial review of their data and then stop. Right after you've identified some central themes, step away from it. If you move too fast into deciding how to act on some of these themes, I found that we can lose sight about how the actions fit into a bigger picture. So the analogy I like to use is almost like when you're buying a house. The first time you visit, you find something that checks all your boxes, you love it, you want to go forward and move in. But the second time you come back on inspection, you see things that you didn't see the first time. So responding to this wide cross-section of feedback that you received from many, many different audiences is the same thing. So review your findings together as a group, step away from it, think about it individually, and in a second meeting of your group, come back, relist the things that you've identified in the first round of analysis, and then start diving into ideas about how to really respond to some of these themes in a way that aligns with what you know, your organization's mission, your organization's vision, your values, and your expertise as nonprofit professionals. Your budget and your available resources will still dictate what actions you can take as a result of the feedback you received, but bring those parameters into the second conversation rather than using them as an immediate framework to either nixing things or setting your strategic direction the first time you're looking at your survey findings and your focus group findings and that kind of thing. So I want to be respectful of your time. Just to jump back to our learning objectives, to refresh our memories, our goal today was to help you figure out who your key internal and external stakeholders are, how you might be able to effectively engage them, and what steps you can take to incorporate their feedback into your next strategic planning project. We've talked about how community engagement is so intertwined into effective strategic planning. Specific ideas for collecting this feedback, like surveys and focus groups and listening sessions and community conversations, and about how the pandemic has revealed to us examples of why it's so important to reach beyond our inner circles and really hear the voices of those we're serving. I hope it sparks some ideas for you, or at least acts as a catalyst for you to start thinking about your own strategic planning process. I wanted to provide a few quick steps you can take today to really move the needle forward on better using components of strategic planning as a community engagement tool. So first, I'd love for you to, after you leave this session, find out if your organization even has a strategic plan. Honestly, it's a simple task, but you'd be surprised at how many people either don't know or have never looked at it or have never used it. Next, and I know this is possible for all of you, think about a decision that you're going to need to make this year. I'm sure you all have very big decisions that are coming up in the near future. Is your organization fully reopened yet? Are you going to be serving a different constituency? Have your fundraising tactics changed? Try to put a finger on what types of information and from what people would be most helpful to you as you make that decision. And then last, think of a couple people outside your closest circle whose opinions you really respect. Maybe it's a friend who's familiar with your work. Maybe it's someone at a similar organization, someone outside your immediate staff, your immediate board. Reach out to them, float an idea by them, or talk with them about a challenge that you're anticipating or something that just keeps you up at night. It's a simple step, but it helps form this philosophy of developing an inclusive and engaged strategic planning process. So with that, I do want to thank you sincerely for attending this webinar. After it's over, please feel free to reach out to me with any comments, questions, or to share stories about what has or hasn't worked for your organization in terms of community engagement and strategic planning. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
We do have one quick question before we wrap up, and the question is, what is the difference between a focus group and a community conversation group?
Sure. So a focus group is a little, I would say, more structured. It's usually a bigger group of people, a format that you may have participated in before, where you have a facilitator asking almost pre-planned questions and collecting those responses back. A community conversation is much more informal. You can almost think of it as a conversation of friends around a kitchen table. Often the people who are conducting community conversations are staff members because they are more informal, and they can be, there are formal training processes for conducting community conversations, but it really can be more of, just talking about the organization at a very informal level. You can have community conversations at a farmer's market, passing by in a grocery store. Those kinds of things would count as a community conversation, where a focus group is just more planned. It's a larger group of people and a bit more formal.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. This workshop has come to a close. All materials and recordings will be available on our website on nonprofitlearninglab.org. Thank you so much for participating in the webinar. And again, thank you so much, Sarah, for educating our community.
Of course, thanks for everyone for attending, and thanks for having me.